My children laughed when I lost my job. They didn't know I had already bought the building they worked in. For 38 years, I arrived at Mason & Gray Financial Tower before sunrise. The security guards knew me by name. The janitors waved as they polished the marble floors. I knew every squeaky elevator, every flickering hallway light, and every employee who rushed in 5 minutes late with coffee in one hand and panic in the other. I wasn't the CEO. I wasn't even a vice president. I was Richard Thompson, the building operations manager. People often underestimated that title. But I kept the entire 40-story building alive. When the heating failed during a snowstorm, I fixed it. When the power grid crashed at midnight, I stayed until morning. When executives wanted everything perfect before investors arrived, they called me, not because I wore expensive suits, but because I always found a solution. My wife had passed away 12 years earlier. After that, my entire world became my 2 children, Daniel and Melissa. I worked overtime, skipped vacations, missed birthdays, sold my classic Mustang, refinanced my house twice, everything so they could graduate from the best universities. Daniel became a corporate attorney. Melissa became a marketing executive. Ironically, both eventually found jobs inside the very building I had spent decades maintaining. I couldn't have been prouder. At least, I thought I couldn't. One rainy Tuesday morning, my boss called me upstairs. His face looked pale. "Richard, close the door." I already knew. After 38 years, you learn to recognize bad news before anyone says it. The company had been sold. A national property management corporation was taking over. They were replacing every senior employee. Cheaper salaries, younger staff, automation, efficiency, corporate words that really meant one thing. "You're too expensive." "I'm sorry," my boss whispered. They gave me no choice. He slid an envelope across the desk. 3 months severance, a plaque, a handshake, 38 years, reduced to a cardboard box. That evening, I called Daniel. "I lost my job today." Silence. Then, "Dad, that's rough." I waited. Maybe he'd ask if I needed anything. Instead, maybe it's finally time to retire. "I still have bills." "Well, you should have planned better." The words hit harder than losing my job. Melissa reacted even worse. "Oh my God, I can't believe this." For 1 second, I thought she was worried. Then she laughed. "You seriously got fired at 63? It wasn't exactly." "Dad, nobody keeps maintenance managers forever. You've got to move with the times." She actually giggled. "I guess I'll stop telling people where you work." That Friday, the family gathered for dinner at Melissa's expensive downtown condo. Daniel arrived wearing a $2,000 suit. Melissa talked nonstop about promotions. Her husband bragged about stock options. No one asked how I was doing. Finally, Daniel raised his wine glass. "Well, here's to Dad's retirement." Everyone laughed, except me. Melissa smirked. "So what are you going to do now?" "Deliver groceries, maybe drive Uber." Her husband nearly spit out his wine laughing. Daniel added, "You finally get to see what the real world is like." The real world. Interesting choice of words, because none of them knew where I'd spent the last 2 years. 2 years earlier, one of my oldest friends had called. "Richard, I've got an investment opportunity." It involved the building, not the company. The building itself. The owners wanted to quietly sell before announcing corporate restructuring. Most investors ignored it. The maintenance costs looked enormous. But I knew something nobody else knew. The location, the leases, the hidden renovation plans approved by the city. I knew that building was about to double in value. Over 38 years, I'd saved every bonus, every overtime check, every tax refund. I never bought luxury cars. Never upgraded my small house. Never wasted money trying to impress strangers. Quietly, I had built significant investments. Dividend stocks, municipal bonds, rental properties. Nothing flashy, just patience. Together with 3 private investors, I became the majority owner of Mason & Gray Tower. Nobody outside our investment group knew. Not even my children, especially not my children. So while everyone at dinner laughed, I simply smiled. Melissa noticed. "What's so funny?" "Oh, I was just thinking." "About what?" "How quickly life changes." Daniel rolled his eyes. "Dad's getting philosophical." More laughter. I finished my coffee, stood up, picked up my old coat. I should head home. Melissa didn't even walk me to the door. Monday morning, Daniel rushed into the building carrying expensive coffee. Melissa followed 5 minutes later. Employees whispered. Something unusual was happening. Luxury black SUVs lined the entrance. Lawyers, real estate consultants, security teams, everyone wondered the same thing. Who bought the building? Rumors spread through every floor. A billionaire, a foreign investment fund, a technology company. At exactly 9 o'clock, every employee received the same email. Mandatory all-hands meeting. Attendance required. Main lobby. 10 a.m. Daniel texted Melissa. Probably another restructuring. She replied, hopefully they don't cut bonuses. Neither of them noticed the black sedan quietly pulling into the underground executive parking garage. The driver stepped out first, then opened the rear door. Richard Thompson adjusted his tie, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the private executive elevator. The same elevator he had never been allowed to use in 38 years. The executive elevator climbed silently to the 40th floor. Richard looked at his reflection in the polished steel doors. It felt strange wearing the same navy suit he had owned for nearly 10 years while walking into a floor he had spent decades maintaining but was never invited to enter. A receptionist smiled nervously. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson." It was the first time anyone in the building had addressed him that way. Inside the boardroom, 4 investors stood to greet him. "Congratulations," one of them said. "Today the ownership transfer becomes official." Richard nodded quietly. "I don't want unnecessary layoffs. We expected you to say that. And I want every employee evaluated by their work, not their title." The attorneys exchanged smiles. That was exactly why they had trusted Richard to become the majority owner. At exactly 10 a.m., more than 600 employees filled the grand lobby. Daniel stood beside the legal department. Melissa chatted with coworkers from marketing. Everyone whispered about the mysterious new owner. A temporary stage had been built overnight. The company's regional director walked to the microphone. "Good morning, everyone. As many of you know, Mason & Gray Tower officially has new ownership." The room became silent. "We are pleased to introduce the majority owner." A dramatic pause followed. Mr. Richard Thompson. For several seconds, nobody moved, nobody breathed. Then Richard stepped onto the stage. The same maintenance manager everyone had ignored for years. The same father his own children had laughed at just 3 days earlier. Melissa's smile disappeared. Daniel blinked twice, convinced he had heard the wrong name. Richard stood calmly behind the microphone. "Good morning. I've worked in this building for 38 years. I know every pipe, every hallway, every office, and most importantly, I know the people." Employees began applauding, not politely, genuinely. Many remembered how Richard had helped them over the years. He had stayed late to unlock offices. He had carried heavy boxes. He had fixed flooded workspaces before important meetings. He had never asked for recognition. The applause grew louder. Daniel slowly lowered his eyes. Melissa looked completely frozen. Richard continued, "I lost my position last week. Some people believed my career had ended." He paused. "But sometimes, losing one job is simply preparing you for another." The room laughed softly. "As the new owner, I promise 3 things. No unnecessary layoffs, no favoritism, and everyone, including executives, will be judged by character before performance." Those last words felt unusually personal. Melissa swallowed hard. Daniel could barely meet his father's eyes. The meeting ended. Employees lined up to shake Richard's hand. One elderly janitor hugged him. "You deserve this more than anyone." A young receptionist wiped tears from her eyes. "You always treated us like family." Richard thanked each person patiently. Across the lobby, Daniel and Melissa stood alone. Neither knew how to approach him. Finally Daniel walked forward. "Dad." Richard smiled politely. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson." Daniel corrected himself awkwardly. Richard chuckled. "You've never needed to call me that." Daniel looked ashamed. "I didn't know." "No," Richard answered gently. "You never asked." Melissa finally spoke. "You own the whole building." "The majority of it." She stared at him in disbelief. "But how?" Richard looked at both of them. "By living below my means. By saving instead of showing off. By investing instead of impressing people. And by remembering that wealth is something you build quietly." Neither of them had an answer. For the first time in years, their father had become the person everyone in the building admired. And they realized they had never truly known him. The news spread through the city before lunchtime. Former building manager becomes majority owner of Mason & Gray Tower. Employees couldn't stop talking about it. Some called it unbelievable, others called it inspiring. Richard ignored the attention. He spent his first day doing exactly what he had always done, walking every floor, greeting security guards, janitors, receptionists, and maintenance crews by name. Nothing changes just because my office is bigger, he told them with a smile. The workers respected him more than ever. Meanwhile, Daniel sat silently in the legal department. His coworker leaned over and whispered, "Your father is incredible. You must be proud." Daniel forced a smile. "I am." But inside, guilt was eating him alive. He remembered every ignored phone call, every birthday he had skipped, every time he treated his father like an inconvenience. Across the building, Melissa wasn't doing any better. Her coworkers couldn't stop praising Richard. "He's so humble. He knows everyone's name. I've never seen an owner shake hands with the cleaning staff." One colleague added with a laugh, "You must have learned your kindness from him." Melissa lowered her eyes. She knew the truth. She hadn't. That evening, Richard returned to his modest home. The same small house he'd lived in for over 30 years. The furniture was old. The kitchen was simple. Nothing about it suggested he was now worth tens of millions of dollars. He smiled at the framed photograph of his late wife, Helen. "I hope I made you proud today," he whispered. Just then, the doorbell rang. Daniel stood outside, alone. "Dad, can we talk?" Richard stepped aside. "Come in." Daniel looked around the house. Nothing had changed. "You could buy a mansion now." Richard smiled. "I already have a home." Daniel sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology." Richard didn't interrupt. "When you lost your job, I judged you. I thought success meant titles, expensive suits, and big salaries." His voice cracked. "But today I realized, none of those things make a person great." Richard nodded gently. "They don't." Daniel looked at the floor. "I became the kind of man you never raised me to be." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "People make mistakes. The important part is whether they choose to change." Tears filled Daniel's eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad." "I know." Father and son embraced for the first time in years. The next morning, Melissa requested a private meeting. She entered Richard's office with red, tired eyes. She looked nothing like the confident executive who had laughed at him only days before. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said quietly. "I just wanted to tell you. I'm ashamed." Richard remained silent. "When Mom died, you gave us everything. You worked nights. You missed meals. You sold things you loved. And I repaid you by laughing when you lost your job." A tear rolled down her cheek. "I've been a terrible daughter." Richard stood and walked to the window overlooking the city. "When your mother was alive," he said softly, "she always believed success wasn't measured by what you owned." Melissa listened carefully. She believed it was measured by how people felt after spending time with you. He turned back toward her. "So ask yourself one question. When people leave your office, do they feel respected?" Melissa couldn't answer, because she already knew the truth. Melissa left her father's office with tears in her eyes. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about promotions, bonuses, or expensive vacations. She was thinking about her mother. She remembered being 8 years old, watching her father come home exhausted after working a double shift. Despite his fatigue, he still helped her with homework, cooked dinner, and tucked her into bed with a smile. Back then, she had thought he was the strongest man in the world. Somewhere along the way, she had forgotten. The following Monday, Richard made an unexpected announcement. All department heads were required to attend a leadership meeting. Executives assumed it would be about budgets or building renovations. Instead, Richard stood at the front of the conference room and said, "Today, we're not discussing profits." Confused looks spread around the room. "We're discussing people." He projected employee satisfaction surveys on the screen. Several departments had excellent results. Others had terrible ones. The worst scores belonged to the marketing division, Melissa's department. Richard looked around the room. A successful business isn't built by fear. It's built by trust. He announced a new policy. Managers would now be evaluated not only on financial performance, but also on how they treated their teams. Respect, mentorship, and employee well-being would count in every performance review. Some executives looked uncomfortable. Others nodded in agreement. Melissa sat quietly, realizing how many talented employees had transferred because of her demanding leadership. She knew she had to change. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere in the building began to shift. Richard introduced small but meaningful improvements. The janitorial staff received updated equipment and better schedules. Security officers got paid training and clearer career paths. Maintenance crews received bonuses for years of service. An employee emergency fund was created for workers facing unexpected hardships. People noticed the difference. Turnover dropped. Morale improved. Employees smiled more often. The building felt different, not because the walls had changed, but because the culture had. Daniel also began changing. Instead of staying hidden in his office, he started mentoring younger attorneys. He volunteered for community legal clinics on weekends. One afternoon, he stopped by his father's office. "I've been thinking," Daniel said. "About what?" "I've spent years chasing the next promotion." Richard looked up from his desk. "And I forgot why I became a lawyer in the first place." Richard smiled. "It's never too late to remember." Daniel nodded. "I want to make you proud, not because you're the owner, but because you're my father." Richard stood and embraced him. "I've always wanted that more than any title." A month later, the company hosted its annual employee appreciation banquet. Hundreds of employees gathered in the ballroom. When it was time for the keynote speech, everyone expected Richard to talk about growth, investments, or future expansion. Instead, he held up an old, worn-out toolbox. "I carried this toolbox for nearly 4 decades, he said. "It reminded me every day that no job is beneath anyone." The room fell silent. Titles may earn respect for a moment, but character earns it for a lifetime. The audience rose to its feet in a standing ovation. Richard glanced toward Daniel and Melissa. Both were standing, both were applauding, and both had tears in their eyes, not because their father had become wealthy, but because they finally understood the man he had always been. 6 months passed. Under Richard's leadership, Mason and Gray Tower became known as one of the best managed office buildings in the city. Tenant satisfaction reached record highs. Employee turnover fell to its lowest level in company history. The profits grew, but what made Richard happiest wasn't the financial success. It was seeing people smile when they came to work. One Friday afternoon, Richard received an invitation to speak at a local business leadership conference. The auditorium was filled with young entrepreneurs, executives, and business students. When Richard walked onto the stage, the audience applauded warmly. He looked at the crowd and smiled. "I've been called many things in my life," he began. "Maintenance manager, janitor, old-fashioned, and recently, building owner." The audience laughed, "But none of those titles define who I am." He paused. "What defines a person is how they treat others when no one is watching." The room became completely silent. After the speech, dozens of people lined up to shake his hand. Among them were Daniel and Melissa. Not because they were family, but because they admired the man standing before them. When the crowd finally dispersed, Melissa handed Richard a small gift. "What is it?" he asked. "Open it." Inside the box was an old photograph. It showed Richard, Helen, Daniel, and Melissa standing in front of their tiny first home. The corners were worn, but the smiles were genuine. Melissa's voice trembled. "I found it in Mom's old photo album. I realized something. We spent years chasing bigger houses, nicer cars, and impressive job titles, while forgetting the richest years of our lives were the ones we spent together." Richard gently traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb. For a moment, he couldn't speak. A week later, Richard made one final announcement. The entire company gathered in the lobby once again. Many expected news of another expansion. Instead, Richard said, "Today, I'd like to introduce something new." He unveiled the Helen Thompson Employee Scholarship Fund, named in honor of his late wife. The fund would provide financial assistance for employees' children to attend college, pursue vocational training, or continue their education. "I know what it's like to wonder how you'll pay tuition," Richard said. "My wife and I faced that struggle many years ago. If this scholarship helps even one family build a better future, then her kindness will continue to live on." Many employees wiped away tears. The applause lasted several minutes. That evening, Richard visited Helen's grave. He placed fresh white lilies beside the headstone. The sun was beginning to set. Soft golden light covered the cemetery. "I kept my promise," he whispered. "I took care of our children. And I think they finally found their way back." Behind him, footsteps approached. He turned around. Daniel, Melissa, their spouses, and Richard's grandchildren. Without saying a word, they stood beside him. Daniel placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "We're here because family comes first." Melissa nodded. "And from now on, we'll never forget that again." Richard looked toward the sky. For the first time in many years, his heart felt completely at peace. A year after Richard Thompson became the majority owner of Mason and Gray Tower, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Employees smiled more, Tenants renewed their leases, and the building had become a model of integrity and leadership. But success has a way of attracting attention. One Monday morning, Richard received a confidential offer from a massive real estate corporation. They wanted to buy the building for nearly 3 times what he had paid. The number was staggering. It was more money than he or his family could ever spend. The investors who had partnered with Richard were thrilled. "We should sell," one of them insisted. "This is the opportunity of a lifetime." Richard asked for a week to think. News of the possible sale spread quickly. Employees grew anxious. Rumors filled every hallway. Will there be layoffs? Will the new owners replace everyone? The same fear Richard had experienced when he lost his own job began spreading through the building. Daniel noticed it first. A young receptionist sat at her desk trying not to cry. "My husband just lost his job," she whispered. "If this building gets sold, I don't know what we'll do." Daniel remembered the day his own father had called after losing his job, and how cold his response had been. This time, he didn't walk away. He sat beside her and said, "Whatever happens, we'll get through it together." It was a small act of kindness, but it showed how much he had changed. Melissa was changing too. Her department had become one of the highest rated in the company. Instead of demanding perfection through fear, she encouraged her team, celebrated their successes, and helped new employees grow. One afternoon, she walked into Richard's office. "If you sell the building," she said quietly, "please don't do it because of us." Richard looked surprised. "You spent your whole life building something meaningful," she continued. "If selling it means hurting the people who trusted you, then the money isn't worth it." Richard smiled. Those words sounded exactly like something Helen would have said. At the end of the week, the board of investors met. Everyone expected Richard to approve the sale. Instead, he stood and said, "When I was laid off, I learned how quickly a decision made in a boardroom can change someone's life." He looked around the table. "I won't do that to hundreds of families just because someone offered me a bigger check." One investor frowned. "You'd walk away from millions." Richard answered calmly, "I already have enough. What I don't have is another chance to protect the people who helped build this place." The room fell silent. One by one, the investors nodded. The sale was rejected. When the announcement was made, the building erupted in applause. Employees weren't cheering because they had kept their jobs. They were cheering because, for the first time in their careers, they believed the person at the top truly cared about them. That afternoon, the janitor who had worked beside Richard for over 20 years knocked on his office door. "I just wanted to say thank you." Richard smiled. "You've thanked me enough over the years." The janitor shook his head. "No, you once told me every person in this building mattered. Today, you proved you believed it." Months later, Richard officially announced his retirement as day-to-day manager of the building. He remained the owner but appointed a leadership team chosen for their integrity rather than their titles. Daniel accepted a position leading the company's ethics and compliance program. Melissa became director of employee development, helping train future managers to lead with respect and compassion. Neither promotion came because they were Richard's children. They earned those roles by becoming the people they should have been all along. On Richard's final afternoon in the office, employees gathered in the lobby one last time. Someone brought out the old, scratched toolbox he had carried for decades. Every employee had signed it. Inside the lid were hundreds of handwritten messages. "Thank you for believing in us. You taught us what leadership looks like. You changed my life." Richard closed the toolbox slowly, his eyes shining with tears. "This," he said softly, "is worth more than any building." As he walked out the front doors, every employee stood on both sides of the lobby, applauding. Not because a wealthy owner was leaving, but because a good man was. Outside, Daniel and Melissa were waiting. No luxury cars, no business meetings, no speeches, just family. Richard looked up at the building one last time. He smiled. He had entered it decades earlier as a maintenance manager. He left it as something far greater. Not simply its owner, but the man who reminded everyone inside that true success is measured not by how high you climb, but by how many people you lift with you. Nearly 2 years after Richard Thompson had become the owner of Mason and Gray Tower, the building had earned a reputation that no amount of advertising could buy. People didn't simply want to rent offices there. They wanted to work there. Business magazines praised the company's culture. Leadership experts invited Richard to speak at conferences. Yet every morning, he still arrived before sunrise with a cup of black coffee, greeting the security guards by name. "Good morning, Carlos." "Morning, Mr. Thompson." Call me Richard. Some habits never changed. One rainy morning, Richard noticed a young maintenance worker sitting alone in the basement workshop. The young man looked worried. Richard sat beside him. Tough day. The worker nodded. My father lost his job last week. Richard remained quiet. My parents sacrificed everything so I could work here. I feel like I'm letting them down. Richard smiled gently. Do you know why I kept my old toolbox? The young man shook his head. Because it reminds me where I started. He pointed toward the building above them. Never be embarrassed by honest work. The world may admire expensive suits, but every successful company still depends on people willing to fix what's broken. The young man smiled for the first time that day. That afternoon, Daniel walked into Richard's office carrying a folder. I've got something for you. Richard opened it. Inside was a proposal for a new employee assistance program. What is this? Daniel smiled. It's for workers facing emergencies. Medical bills, unexpected job loss in the family, education grants. I thought about what you did for us growing up. I want every employee's family to feel that same security. Richard looked at his son with pride. This is exactly the kind of leader your mother hoped you'd become. Melissa had a surprise of her own. She launched a mentorship program that paired senior employees with new hires. Instead of competing against one another, departments began sharing ideas and helping each other succeed. Within a year, employee satisfaction reached another record high. Visitors often asked the same question. What's your secret? Employees always gave the same answer. We work for people who remember where they came from. One Friday evening, Richard invited his entire family to dinner. Not at an expensive restaurant, but at the small neighborhood diner where he and Helen had celebrated their first wedding anniversary decades earlier. Daniel laughed as he looked around. I haven't been here since I was a kid. The food tastes exactly the same, Melissa said with a smile. Richard nodded. So do the memories. During dinner, his youngest granddaughter looked up and asked, Grandpa, were you always rich? The table became silent. Richard laughed softly. No, I was rich long before I had money. She tilted her head. How? I had your grandmother. I had my children, and I had work that gave me purpose. He smiled warmly. Money came much later. The little girl thought for a moment before saying, Then I think I'm rich too. Everyone at the table laughed. Richard's eyes filled with tears. Helen would have loved hearing those words. Several months later, the city announced its annual Community Leadership Awards. Hundreds of business owners were nominated. When the winner was announced, the audience stood to applaud. Richard Thompson. As he walked to the stage, the applause continued for nearly a full minute. The presenter handed him the award. You've shown that leadership is measured not by power, but by service. Richard looked at the audience before speaking. I accept this award on behalf of every janitor, receptionist, security guard, technician, assistant, and maintenance worker who keeps businesses running without expecting applause. They are the real foundation of every successful company. The standing ovation was louder than ever. Later that night, Richard returned to Mason and Gray Tower one last time before heading home. The lobby was quiet. The marble floors reflected the city lights. He walked slowly through the building, remembering every stage of his journey. The first day he had carried a toolbox through those doors. The long nights fixing broken pipes. The difficult day he lost his job. The unforgettable morning he returned as the owner. Every step had taught him something. As he reached the front entrance, he paused and looked back. I didn't just buy a building, he whispered. I found a family. Outside, Daniel and Melissa were waiting beside the car. You ready to go home, Dad? Daniel asked. Richard smiled. I already am. Together, they drove away, not as a wealthy businessman and his successful children, but as a family that had finally rediscovered what truly mattered. The building remained behind them, standing tall against the evening sky. Its greatest legacy was never its value or its impressive design. Its greatest legacy was the example of one humble man who proved that kindness, integrity, and quiet perseverance will always outlast pride, wealth, and status. The first snow of winter covered the city in white. Richard stood near the large windows of Mason and Gray Tower, watching employees arrive one by one. Some hurried through the cold with coffee in their hands, while others stopped to help coworkers carrying heavy boxes. Moments like these made him smile. The culture of the building had changed. People looked after one another. Just then, his assistant knocked on the office door. Mr. Thompson, there's someone here asking to see you. He says he doesn't have an appointment, but he insists you'll remember him. Send him in. A man in his early 70s walked into the office. His suit was old, and his hands showed the signs of decades of hard work. Richard looked at him for a moment before his face lit up. George. The two men embraced. George had trained Richard on his very first day in the building nearly 40 years earlier. "I heard what you've done with this place," George said with a smile. "I had to see it for myself." Richard poured 2 cups of coffee. "You taught me everything I know." George laughed. "No, I only taught you how to fix boilers. The rest came from your heart." For the next hour, they shared stories about the old days, the broken elevators, late-night repairs, and the friendships built through years of honest work. As George prepared to leave, he looked around Richard's office. "I've visited plenty of owners over the years. They all decorated their offices with awards." He pointed toward the old toolbox sitting on Richard's bookshelf. "But you're the first one who displayed the tool that built his future." Richard smiled. "That's because I never want to forget where I started." George nodded proudly. "I always knew you'd go far." Richard shook his head. "No, I just kept moving forward." Outside, snow continued to fall. Inside, the building was warmer than ever, not because of its heating system, but because of the people who filled it with kindness every single day. Richard looked around the lobby one more time before returning to work. He no longer measured success by the building he owned. He measured it by the lives that had become better because he never stopped believing that every person deserved dignity and respect. And in that quiet moment, he realized something his children had finally learned as well.